Harold Mitchell had 48 hours to figure out how to cut his power bill by $60 a month, or the bank was taking his farm. It was July 1953 in Butler County, Kansas, and he was sitting at his kitchen table at 5 in the morning with 3 pieces of paper spread out in front of him. The electric bill from Kansas Power and Light, $78.40. The letter from First National Bank in El Dorado. Payment on the farm loan was 3 months overdue. Foreclosure proceedings would begin if he couldn't show a viable plan to make payments by Monday. And a Western Union telegram from his wheat buyer. Prices had dropped again. His entire crop would bring in $580 after hauling costs. The math was simple and brutal. His monthly expenses were running $190. His income from wheat, cattle, and Margaret's egg money averaged $140, $50 short every month, and that gap was widening. The power bill alone was eating up more than half his profit margin. Margaret came into the kitchen, saw the papers, saw his face. She'd been married to him for 7 years, long enough to read his silences. How bad? "We've got until Monday to convince John Matheson at the bank that we can turn this around," Harold said. "If I can't show him real numbers, a real plan, he's starting foreclosure." His hands are tied. The bank examiners are all over him about bad farm loans. She sat down across from him, her hands folded on the table. Margaret was a town girl from Augusta, who'd married into farm life without fully understanding what she was signing up for. But she'd learned fast, learned to keep chickens and a garden, learned to stretch a dollar until it screamed. "What are you thinking?" Harold looked out the window where the sky was just starting to lighten. Beyond the barn, he could see the silhouette of the old air motor windmill, its wheel turning slowly in the pre-dawn breeze. "My father tried to tell me something before he died. I thought he was just being sentimental about the old days, but he kept saying, 'Don't tear down what works, Harold. Don't tear it down just because something newer comes along.'" "The windmill," Margaret said. "That windmill's been pumping stock water for 26 years without costing us 1 cent in power," Harold said. "Every day, all day, whenever there's wind, which in Kansas means just about always. If I was pumping that with an electric motor, running it 4 or 5 hours a day, what would that cost?" Margaret was quick with numbers, always had been. Electric motor that size, probably pulling 3-4 kilowatts when it's running. 4 hours a day, 30 days, that's $25–30 a month easy. $30 we're not paying, Harold said, because we've got wind, and my grandfather knew enough to harness it back in 1927. He stood up, started pacing. "There's more, come with me." He led her outside in the cool morning air, past the chicken coop to where an old stone spring house sat half buried in the hillside. Harold pulled open the wooden door, and they could hear water flowing inside, a constant gentle sound that had been there every day of their marriage. "This spring puts out about 20 gallons a minute, year-round. My father built a water wheel here in 41, ran it to a car generator, charged batteries that powered the whole house during the war. He took it apart when we got grid power in 48, but the wheel mount's still there, the springs still flowing." Margaret knelt by the spring, put her hand in the cold, clear water. "Could you rebuild it?" "I think so," Harold said. "Pete Hansen over in Rosalia. He's a machinist at Boeing. He could help me wind a proper generator. We'd need batteries, some wire, but we could run the refrigerator and lights off this, take that load completely off the grid. That's another $20–25 a month." "That's $55, Margaret said, doing the math. "That gets us to break even, Harold, but it doesn't get us ahead. And you've got to spend money to build this system." "Money we don't have." Harold nodded. "I know, but there's one more thing." He took her to the old machine shed where equipment sat gathering dust. He pulled back a canvas tarp, revealing a 2-cylinder John Deere Model E stationary engine. "My father ran this engine for 15 years, powered everything from a corn sheller to a saw. One engine, one source of power, but he had it set up with jack shafts and line shafts so he could run 6 different machines throughout the day. Right now I've got 4 separate electric motors, 4 motors, 4 separate power draws, all adding to that bill every month." "How much would it cost to get this running again?" Margaret asked. "Rings and gaskets, maybe $50 in parts. I can do the work myself." Harold ran his hand along the engine's cool metal. "Gas is 20 cents a gallon now. This engine will run 8 hours on a gallon, and I don't need it running every day, just when I'm processing grain or doing shop work. Margaret looked at the engine, looked at her husband. So you're going to walk into John Matheson's office on Monday and tell him you're going to save the farm with a windmill and some equipment from the 1920s. I'm going to show him the numbers, Harold said. With $300 in parts and materials, I can cut our power bill from $78 to maybe $15 or $20. That $60 monthly savings, $720 a year, is enough to make our loan payments and start catching up on what we owe. $300 we don't have, Margaret reminded him. Harold was silent for a long moment. My mother's wedding ring. It's worth $400 at least. My father wanted me to have something to fall back on. Margaret reached across and put her hand over his. Then you better make this work. Harold spent Friday tearing down the John Deere engine, learning all over again the skills his father had taught him as a boy. The cylinder bores were still smooth, the crank journals barely worn. By Friday evening he had it apart on his workbench, a list of what he needed from the implement dealer in El Dorado. Saturday morning he drove into town with his mother's ring in his pocket. Maya Goldstein at the jewelry store didn't ask unnecessary questions. $420, he said. And Harold, when you get back on your feet, you come see me. Harold bought the parts he needed, bought batteries from the truck dealership, bought copper wire and electrical components. He had $80 left when he drove home, barely enough for groceries through the end of the month. Saturday afternoon, he reassembled the engine while Margaret cooked dinner for Pete Hansen and his wife. Pete came out to the shed after eating, looked at Harold's Springhouse setup, did some calculations. Yeah, I can wind you a generator that'll handle this flow and drop. 12-volt system, 15-amp continuous output. Bring me that car generator Monday after work. I'll have it done by Wednesday. I can't pay you right now, Harold said. You helped me roof my barn last summer, Pete said. This is what neighbors do. Sunday, Harold got the John Deere engine back together and spent 3 hours getting it timed right. By evening, he had it running smooth, ready to hook up to the old line shaft system that still ran down the length of the barn. Monday morning at 8 o'clock, Harold walked into First National Bank with a folder full of papers. Electric bills from the past year showing the climbing costs, detailed breakdown of his current power usage, estimates of what each alternative system would cost to build, projected savings month by month. John Matheson was a careful banker, cautious by nature and training. He looked through Harold's papers with the expression of a man who'd seen a lot of desperate farmers with a lot of desperate plans. Harold, I appreciate the work you put into this, but you're proposing to run a modern farm on technology from before rural electrification. That's going backward. I'm proposing to cut a $78 monthly expense to $15, and Harold said. That's $756 a year that stays in the farm operation instead of going to the power company. If it works, Matheson said. It worked for 30 years before we had grid power, Harold said. It worked for my father, my grandfather, thousands of farms across Kansas. I'm not inventing anything. I'm just using what's already there. Matheson tapped the photos of the windmill. This thing's 26 years old. What if it breaks down? Then I fix it, Harold said. Every part in that windmill can be rebuilt or replaced. Air Motor still makes them. Parts are standard and available. Matheson looked at the numbers again, checked Harold's arithmetic. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. I'll give you 90 days. You show me 3 months of power bills under $20. You show me your loan payment current, and we'll restructure the debt. But Harold, if this doesn't work, if those bills don't come down, I can't protect you anymore. 90 days, Harold said. That's all I need. He left the bank and went straight to work. The windmill needed maintenance it hadn't gotten in 5 years. Harold climbed that 30-foot tower with a grease gun and a toolbox, fighting a fear of heights he'd never quite gotten over. 3 hours of work on top of that swaying tower, with Kansas wind pushing against him and his hands slipping on sun-heated steel. By the time he climbed down, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his legs were shaking, but the windmill was running smoother than it had in years. He stood and watched it turn in the steady south breeze, the sucker rod rising and falling with mechanical precision, water flowing into the stock tank in a steady stream. The Springhouse generator took longer. Pete delivered the rewound generator on Wednesday, and Harold spent Thursday and Friday building a water wheel 8 feet in diameter, mounted on a steel shaft salvaged from an old hay rake. Getting it positioned right, angled to catch the maximum flow, balanced so it would turn smoothly under load, took patience and repeated adjustments. Friday evening it was finally turning steadily, the generator humming, voltage meter showing a solid 12 volts. He wired it to his battery bank, watched the ammeter needle swing over to show 15 amps of charging current. Those batteries would hold enough power to run the refrigerator continuously and provide lighting for the house. Saturday he tackled the line shaft system in the barn, rebuilding decades-old mounts, replacing worn belts, setting up pulley ratios that would let his John Deere engine power multiple implements. The work required precision, demanded an understanding of mechanical advantage and power transmission that most modern farmers had lost. By Sunday evening, 1 week after his meeting with Matheson, Harold had 3 systems running. The windmill pumped stock water continuously. The Springhouse generator kept batteries charged, powering the refrigerator and lights with electricity from flowing water. The stationary engine sat ready in the barn, capable of running all his heavy power needs for the cost of a few gallons of gas per month. Monday morning the power bill arrived. Harold opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. $18.35, down from $78 the previous month. But one good month wasn't enough. Matheson wanted 3 months, wanted proof the systems would hold up, wanted to see consistent savings before he'd restructure the loan. August was brutal. Temperatures hit 105 degrees for 6 straight days, and Harold's Springhouse generator started overheating. The car generator Pete had rewound wasn't designed for continuous duty in that kind of heat. By mid-month it was cutting out for hours at a time, and their power bill jumped to $32 as Harold had to rely more on grid electricity to keep the refrigerator running. Harold spent 3 evenings and a full Saturday rebuilding the generator mount, adding cooling fins, improving air circulation around the armature. By the end of August he had it stable again, but that month's power bill ate into his projected savings. $32 was better than $78, but it wasn't the 15 or 20 he'd promised Matheson. September brought a different problem. The wind died. Kansas usually had steady breezes, but that September was eerily calm. Day after day of still air and oppressive heat. The windmill sat motionless above the stock tank, not pumping a drop. Harold's cattle needed water, and he didn't have enough stored capacity to last more than 3 days. He fired up the John Deere engine, belted it to the well pump and started pumping by engine power. A gallon of gas would run the engine for 8 hours and pump enough water for his herd for 2 days, which was still cheaper than electric pumping, but it was purchased fuel, not free wind. And it meant running the engine daily instead of just for periodic grain processing. The September power bill came in at $23, better than before but still not where it needed to be. Harold had 1 month left, 1 more power bill to show Matheson, and he needed it to be low enough to prove the systems worked, even when conditions weren't perfect. October, the wind came back. Strong, steady breezes from the northwest, the kind of wind that made Kansas windmills sing. Harold's air motor spun day and night, the sucker rod pumping in steady rhythm, the stock tank staying full without costing him a cent. The Springhouse generator ran cool in the autumn temperatures. The batteries stayed charged. The refrigerator hummed along on free power from flowing water. Harold used the John Deere engine only twice that month, just for grain processing, burning less than 5 gallons of gas total. Everything else ran on wind and water, natural energy that flowed whether he harnessed it or not. The October power bill arrived on November 2nd, 3 days before his 90-day meeting with Matheson. Harold opened it in the kitchen with Margaret standing beside him. $12.60. Margaret exhaled slowly. That's it. That's what we needed. Harold spread out all 3 months of bills on the kitchen table. $18 in August, $32 in September when the generator overheated, $23 in September during the calm spell, $12 in October. Average over 90 days, $21.45, down from an average of $74 the previous 90 days. Savings, $52.55 per month, $630 annually. Enough to make the loan payments if wheat prices stayed steady, enough to start paying down the back payments they owed. But there was a problem. Harold had promised Matheson power bills under $20. He delivered that in August and October, but September had spiked to $32 and $23. Would Matheson accept an average of $21, or would he see those high months as proof the systems weren't reliable enough? Harold couldn't sleep the night before the meeting. He lay awake running scenarios, trying to figure out how to present the numbers, what to say if Matheson focused on those problem months instead of the overall savings. Margaret found him at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning, going over the bills again. "Harold, you did what you said you'd do. You cut the power bill in half. You found $600 a year in savings. If John Matheson can't see that, if the bank won't work with you after you've proven this works, then they were never going to help us anyway." "We'll lose the farm," Harold said quietly. "Maybe," Margaret said, "but we'll lose it knowing we tried everything we could think of, and that counts for something." Harold walked into First National Bank at 8 o'clock on November 5th with his folder of power bills, his maintenance logs showing what he'd done to fix the overheating generator, his weather records documenting the unusual September calm that had required engine pumping. He had 3 months of proof, but he didn't know if it was enough. Matheson took the bills, examined them one by one, made notes on a pad. He looked at the August bill, nodded, looked at the September bills, frowned, looked at the October bill, tapped it with his pen. "You had problems in September," Matheson said. "Generator overheated during the heat wave," Harold explained. "I redesigned the cooling system. It's been running stable since mid-August, and we had an unusual calm spell. No wind for 12 days straight. I had to pump by engine power, which meant buying gas. But that's still cheaper than electric pumping, and October showed what the systems can do when conditions are normal." Matheson calculated the average, checked it against Harold's projections. $21.45 average. "You promised me under 20. "I promised you I could cut the bill from $78 to 15 or 20, Harold said. "I'm averaging 21, even with equipment problems and unusual weather. That's a savings of $52 a month, $630 a year. That's enough to make my loan payments and start catching up on what I owe. And now that I've solved the generator cooling problem and I've learned how to handle calm periods, the bills should stay in the $12 to $15 range going forward." Matheson was silent for a long time, looking at the numbers, looking at Harold. Finally, he pulled out a different folder, opened it to show Harold's loan documents. "The bank examiners are pushing me hard on farm loans. They want me to foreclose on anything that's more than 60 days past due. I've been holding them off on your loan because your father banked with us for 40 years and never missed a payment." Harold felt his stomach drop. This was it. This was Matheson telling him it wasn't enough. "But these numbers," Matheson continued, tapping the power bills, "these numbers show me something the examiners need to see. They show me a farmer who identified a problem, found a solution, implemented it successfully, and achieved measurable results. That's the kind of farm management that makes a loan viable long-term." Matheson pulled out a pen, started writing on Harold's loan documents. "I'm going to restructure your debt. We'll extend the term by 3 years, which will lower your monthly payment from $68 to $45. That gives you breathing room. You keep showing me power bills in this range, you keep making those $45 payments on time, and we'll work through this together." Harold couldn't speak for a moment. He'd been braced for foreclosure, for losing everything, and instead Matheson was offering him a lifeline. "Thank you, John," he finally managed. "You won't regret this." "I better not," Matheson said, but there was warmth in his voice. "Now get out of here and go run that farm. And Harold, keep those power bills. In 20 years, when some banker asks me why I took a risk on a farmer who was 3 months behind on his loan, I want to be able to show them what you did." Harold walked out of that bank into November sunshine with his loan restructured and his farm secure. He drove home and found Margaret in the garden, told her what Matheson had said. She put down her hoe and wrapped her arms around him, and they stood there in the garden for a long moment, not saying anything, just holding on to each other and to the farm they'd almost lost. That evening, Harold climbed the windmill tower one more time, watched the sun set over his land, while the wheels spun above him in the steady Kansas wind. The mill had been there since 1927, had pumped water through the Dust Bowl and the Depression, had kept turning when half the farms in Butler County went under. His father had known enough to install it, known enough to maintain it, known enough to keep it running even when grid power arrived and neighbors were tearing their mills down as obsolete junk. Now that same mill, that same technology, that same free power from Kansas wind had saved Harold's farm when nothing else could. Not newer equipment, not modern methods, not any amount of hoping wheat prices would improve. Just an old windmill, a springhouse generator, and a stationary engine, harnessing energy that nature provided for free, cutting costs enough to make the difference between keeping the farm and losing it. The wheel turned above him, catching the last light of the day, and Harold understood what his father had been trying to tell him before he died. Some things work because they're built on principles that don't change. Wind blows, water flows, and well-designed systems that harness those forces keep working decade after decade, generation after generation. That wasn't being old-fashioned. That was being smart enough to use what works, regardless of how long it's been working. Harold climbed down from that tower as the stars came out, walked back to the farmhouse where Margaret had supper waiting, and slept soundly for the first time in 4 months. The farm was safe, the systems were proven, and that windmill would still be spinning long after he was gone, still pumping free water from Kansas wind, still doing exactly what it was built to do. Thank you for watching this story about the power systems that sustained American farms through the hardest times. If you found this valuable, please subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone interested in farm wisdom and rural heritage. This video is inspired by true events and real farming practices from the 1930s through 1970s. Harold Mitchell is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during this era, finding practical solutions in proven technology that had served previous generations. This content does not aim to represent or offend any individual or community.